Okay, I think we can get started. We have 65 people right now. So I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers and myself. My name's Batul. I'm the policy manager at Climate and Community Project. You're all here for this webinar discussion of our latest report, Achieving Zero Emissions with More Mobility and Less Mining. This is a partnered report between Climate and Community Project and UC Davis. It uses first of its kind modeling to show the lithium intensity of multiple pathways to a decarbonized personal transportation system in the US. If you haven't heard of the Climate and Community Project, we are a climate justice think tank. We work to advance the transformative policies, investments, and new ways, new frameworks of thinking that we need to not only address the climate crisis at scale, but also ensure that the multiracial working class, that the frontline, the environmental justice communities across the world benefit from climate policy. So today we're really excited to be hosting this briefing on the report with two of our report authors and two partner organizations who work directly with communities who are affected by lithium mining. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce our speakers, who include Kassandra Lisenbee from Great Basin Resource Watch based in Nevada. She's their Outreach and Just Energy Transition Director. We have Ramón Balcázar, who is a member of the frontline organization OPSOL, which is based in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. We have Dr. Alissa Kendall, report author, professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Davis, and Thea Riofrancos, who is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a member of Climate and Community Project, and an author of the report. We're gonna save plenty of time for questions at the end, which you can put in the Q&A box. We are also recording this presentation. It's currently recording right now. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Thea to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Batul, and thanks for so many people making it out in the afternoon, or depending where you are, morning, afternoon, or evening. It's great to see almost 100 folks on and more folks streaming in. So as Batul said, this is a briefing on our recently published report, Achieving Zero Emissions with More Mobility and Less Mining. And as I think the title suggests, what our report tries to do is think about what the most socially, environmentally, and climate just future for transportation might look like. So I guess that sort of raises the question immediately of why are we focused on transportation? And I'll specify that our report models the US transportation sector, and that is a particularly polluting transportation sector, even by, in sort of global terms. It's a main driver of US emissions, one of the, I think the leading source of US emissions, as well as the only major sector where we still see rising emissions in the US economy. That it accounts for almost a third of US emissions, which is double the global average for what the transportation sector contributes to the climate crisis. So we understand the urgency of rapidly decarbonizing the transportation sector, given these facts. The question is not whether we decarbonize the transportation sector, but how we decarbonize it. And what this report will get into is the fact that there are multiple electrified futures ahead of us, right? There are multiple futures ahead of us that all get us to zero emissions, but differ dramatically in how much mining they would require, as well as how much mobility they would provide to Americans. So let's move forward and kind of dig in a bit, no pun intended. As I just mentioned, this report looks at what it would take to decarbonize the US transportation sector. And the way that the transportation sector is currently being decarbonized in the US and elsewhere is through the idea that we must massively deploy electric vehicles, right? We are already seeing large growth in the electric vehicle market. We see forecasting agencies around the world, such as the International Energy Agency, saying that we will need 2 billion additional electric vehicles on the road by 2050 to meet zero emissions targets. And year on year, we're seeing increases in this market. What does this mean for mining at the front lines? We know that battery supply chains, batteries being the most complex and expensive component of electric vehicles, have very long supply chains that begin on the front lines of mining in landscapes from Chile to Argentina to Australia to China. This current model of decarbonizing the transportation sector through the massive deployment of EVs to the exclusion of many other transportation options that we'll get into momentarily is already increasing demand for lithium in historic and extraordinary ways. So this on the right shows us what that demand curve looks like, but it also shows us that the primary driver of new lithium demand are passenger electric vehicles specifically. We've seen a lot of concerning statistics for how much that demand will need to increase in order to meet those net zero targets, based on models that, of course, primarily look at individual electric vehicles as the only way to electrify the transportation sector. So the IEA, again, prognosticates a 40-time increase between 2020 and 2040 in total lithium demand. Benchmark Mineral Intelligence predicts 200% increase in individual discrete mines around the world in order to meet 2035 targets for electric vehicle demand. So a lot of new mining is being forecast of lithium alongside other transition minerals in order to furnish an EV-centric transportation decarbonization approach. Can move forward. I want to note, though, that this future has not fully been realized, right? Though we are seeing more and more EVs bought and sold in the United States, we're still at the early stages of decarbonizing our transportation sector. That means that the total volume of extraction of lithium alongside, again, other transition minerals is not a given. And there are still critical political and social and economic choices to be made about how we decarbonize, with huge implications, it turns out, for how much lithium will be demanded, as well as for the contours of those transportation environments at the local level. So just to kind of represent what this critical juncture looks like, we have a future of more e-bikes, of more e-buses, of more walkability, of more affordable green density, versus a future of not only replicating, but doubling down on a car-centric and especially a large car-centric transportation sector represented by President Biden showing off what an electrified Hummer looks like. So we can move on. Next slide. And I want to kind of dramatize this with the visual on the right, which shows you the dramatically different amounts of lithium that are required per person to decarbonize transportation sectors, right? So if we look at the Hummer or the Ford Lightning or some of these really large cars with really large batteries, they have enormous per person and total lithium footprints, right? If we go to a normal sedan, that decreases a bit. But as Alissa will talk about in a moment, we're on a trend to larger batteries. So our cars are getting larger, our batteries are getting larger. So that's concerning. If we go to electric buses, we have a much more socially and ecologically rational use of resources where we have lower mined resources per person. And it gets even better when we go to mobility options like electric bikes, right? And so why is this an issue? There are lots of reasons to be concerned about an energy transition that is so resource intensive, right? And that specifically focuses on EVs as the kind of main approach. One is we know that EVs are very electricity hungry, and it may not be the most kind of rational way to think about using renewable energy. A second is, as we'll talk about quite a bit on this report, it's the most resource intensive way to move forward. And a third, as we'll again discuss, is that there are a number of other safety and equity concerns around a car-centric transportation model, even if those cars are electric. So I'll just get into my last slide before turning it over to our modelers. Ramón and Kassandra will get much more into this, and I would like to just defer to their expertise on the front lines of this mining boom. But I want to just give an overarching sense of why it's important to simultaneously reduce mining and increase mobility as we pivot into this electrified transportation future. And that's because lithium mining, like the mining industry writ large, has a number of really, really concerning social and environmental impacts, as well as climate impacts at the local level, right? So whether we're in Chile, Argentina, Australia, China, or the new mining front lines in Nevada, we see concerning impacts on water, on ecosystems, on biodiversity habitats, on livelihoods that are alternatives to extraction, on indigenous rights and local community rights to participate in these decisions that dramatically affect their landscapes, as well as super exploitation of mining workers around the world. So those are just some of the injustices that we see perpetrated on the front lines of the energy transition. And this is what really motivates the report's desire to think through a less resource-intensive way to get to zero emissions and ultimately align the goals of climate justice, environmental justice, and indigenous justice. So I'll now turn it over to Alissa Kendall, who led the modeling for the report and is going to show some of our really, I think, important and significant findings about getting to zero emissions with less mining than the most alarming projections.
Well, thanks, Thea, for setting the stage like that. I'm going to talk about essentially how we can predict what the lithium footprint of different futures look like, all of which achieve our zero emission by 2050 targets. And you can think about our transportation system as having a number of different levers in it that we can essentially pull to get different outcomes. And I'm going to start by talking about probably the most important, which is sort of how we decide we're going to go about meeting zero emissions and providing mobility to people. And so we thought about 4 potential futures. The first one, labeled scenario 1 here, is basically take what we do today and electrify everything. And this is the most lithium intensive and battery intensive way to go about things because we maintain our car-centric culture in the US, and we don't provide mobility options very well for alternatives. In the following scenarios 2, 3, and 4, we try to basically make our transportation system less car-centric, less personal vehicle-centric. The scenario 2 basically says, what if the US cities and suburbs looked more like a European city and suburb? These cities tend to have lower car dependency than the US while still providing excellent mobility and having about the same levels of density that we see in the US. As we move through the other scenarios, we get more ambitious about saying, hey, what if we densify metropolitan regions? What if we make it much easier to ride public transit or use active modes and less convenient to drive? And as we do this, we can see fewer and fewer people choosing to drive, and that means fewer and fewer cars demanded, and that means fewer batteries in the future. One benefit or co-benefit of all of these is that we have a more equitable and often safer transportation systems as we move away from personal vehicles. Next slide. So these decarbonization pathways are just one of a few different elements in our transportation system that we can play with to try to get to, that we can play with as we get to our net zero by 2050 scenarios. The other scenarios, the other levers that we thought about were essentially how big do the batteries get in our electric vehicles. So we thought about 3 futures. I'll start with the medium one. That's about where we are now. In this scenario, the dominant battery size is about 70 kilowatt hours. And if we go to a small battery future, we're at about 35 kilowatt hours. This is kind of like going back in time, some of the early models, the Nissan Leaf and e-Golf that were around that size. And then we can also see a future where we supersize batteries, where we get really large. So the dominant battery size is 150 kilowatt hours. That's right in between an e-Hummer and a Ford F-150 Lightning pickup truck. But that would be the dominant size that we see. Okay, we also looked at a few other items, things like the EV warranty on batteries, because this would drive different kinds of replacement rates. We found that to be very small, and I won't be presenting any results on that with respect to influencing lithium demand or the sort of the demand for battery materials and mining in the future. Finally, we looked also at lithium recovery via recycling. So when we need materials for batteries, we can get them from a mine. These are primary or virgin materials, but we can also get them from recycled material or secondary content. So we looked at essentially no recovery of lithium via recycling, or the best case scenario where we get 98% of all the lithium in batteries back. To be clear, we do recycle lithium ion batteries right now. However, lithium is not recovered. We recover other precious metals that are worth more. So we're talking, that's sort of what happens today. But we can envision a future through policy levers, for example, that could require that we actually recover lithium from batteries as well. So those are the different levers we looked at and the scenarios we examined. Next slide. So I'm going to show you what a snapshot looks like in 2050 for lithium demand under some of the different scenarios that we looked at. So first, I'm going to talk about the extreme scenarios. The worst case scenario is that we keep our current system of car dependency and we supersize batteries. The best case scenario is that we move to small batteries, we reduce vehicle dependency and ownership rates, and we invest in a really effective recycling system. Those two extremes are extremes, but we can reduce demand by 92%. I want to say that the large battery extreme is not out of this world extreme. Definitely, we see increasing battery sizes, and we need to slow that down. The black bar that you see on the graph there, that's our status quo. That's if we basically take today and we just make it happen in the future. Same car dependency, electrify everything using batteries that are about the size that we use right now. And if we do that, and then we invest in reducing vehicle ownership, meaning we provide transit, we make active modes of travel more attractive and safer to do, we can achieve 67%, 2/3 reduction in demand for lithium in the future. For context, the dashed red line that you see here on the graph, that's the global production of lithium in 2021. So if we do nothing, if we just electrify everything, we will need 3 times what is produced just to supply the US market. And we are not the largest market for vehicles in the world. So you can imagine what that means at a global scale if we can't do better than that. Next slide. What I'm showing you here is the total cumulative demand, meaning if we sum up all the lithium we demand from now until 2050 under all the different scenarios we examined. And just some takeaways from looking at this. We have the battery scenarios each listed, and then the different decarbonization pathway scenarios under each of those battery scenarios. And what you'll see here is that we can definitely achieve significant reductions by reducing vehicle demand over time. There's some evidence we can do that faster, by the way, than electrifying everything. And of course, we get more equity, transport equity out of these systems. It's actually less expensive for travelers, and we have lots of co-benefits from this as well. And we can get up to 66% reduction in cumulative demand if we move from our current scenario to our best case scenario. I also want to point out that the battery scenarios matter quite a bit. And if we can prevent supersizing, we can reduce demand by more than double. So 56% increase if we move to these bigger batteries. So I think we need to put some speed bumps on the bigger battery trend that we're seeing right now. And it would be great if we can shrink it as well, because we get a benefit of 28% if we can go back to smaller batteries. And then finally, this is a graph where I can really highlight the importance of recycling. You'll see here, the blue bars are our demand. The green bars are the recycled content that we generate when we retire a battery and recycle it. And the black diamonds are the net demand, meaning the demand we would get from mining, from new material. And so you can see that recycling delivers us really big benefits between 40 to 54% cumulatively. But if you take a snapshot in the year 2050, it's higher than 70% in some cases of our demand could be met with recycled content. So we really need to make sure that we have, that recycling is also one of these important features of reducing, especially future demand for lithium. Next slide. So in terms of summarizing just the most effective ways for us to reduce future lithium demand while meeting our 2050 goals for decarbonization, we need to focus on reducing demand for passenger vehicles. And this really is about providing and investing in really good mobility options, especially transit and active modes, and of course, helping to densify urban and suburban areas so that transit is more efficient and people don't have to go as far to get to the services that they seek. We need to maintain or reduce battery size in vehicles. We can do this a lot of ways. There are lots of mechanisms, regulatory and policy mechanisms that could be in place to discourage ever-growing battery sizes. And some of that's about investment, like in charging infrastructure, so people don't have range anxiety. Some of it can also be on a regulatory side to prevent these large batteries being so attractive. Finally, we need to make sure that recycling policy and infrastructure is in place that assure high rates of actual material recovery as well. And we did model other factors, including warranty periods, but I haven't presented them because they didn't really have much effect on lithium demand. Next slide. All right, so with that, I'm very pleased to pass the virtual microphone to Kassandra and Ramón, who will be speaking next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm happy to be here. My name is Kassandra Lisenbee. I work for Great Basin Resource Watch. Just a little background, we are an environmental justice nonprofit that works with communities to help protect their land, air, water, and culture from adverse effects of resources extraction in the Great Basin since 1994. Next slide. And I just wanted to give everyone a quick overview here of what we're talking about. So the map on the right, you can see Nevada. This project will be located in the northern region, close to the Nevada-Oregon border, in a wider area called the McDermott Caldera. Up on the top right, you can see the Fort McDermott Reservation, as well as the agricultural community of Orovada, who will be the closest directly affected peoples to this project. And on the left, I have a picture of the land as is, and below a picture of 3D modeling of what could be. Next slide, please. So I really wanted to have a brief history of the federal permitting project on this project. So Lithium Nevada started their community scoping meeting in February of 2020. When we attended these meetings, we heard a lot of community concerns, which really increased our involvement in this project. I also wanted to highlight the time frame here. We did request for BLM to stop permitting during COVID as communities were reeling with a pandemic, and that makes it quite hard to really have community consent and collaboration and evaluation of the incoming project. However, by January 15th, 2021, the record of decision was signed. So this mine was permitted in less than 1 year's time. For comparison, most projects of this size with no complications will take 3 to 5 years in the permitting process. And our executive director, John Hatter, has said that this is one of the worst EISs that he has seen in the last 20 years. And that brought us into federal court in February of 2021. We filed on environmental concerns, but after the record of decision was signed and more news about the project got out, elders from the community came forward to speak about the cultural significance of this landscape, which is not included in the EIS. And for folks, it's the environmental impact statement, which is a glaring example of the lack of consultation on this process. Next slide, please. So some of the impacts to the environment and the sacred landscapes of the area. Another example of the rush of this project is that the federal permit allows for the company to go below the water table, and without proper mitigation, that could produce groundwater contamination for a minimum of 300 years. Just to show the speed in which this process was pushed through, the state permit does actually not allow the company to go below the water table, as they found the mitigation to not be acceptable. There's high annual consumptive water use for processing, and there will need to be a sulfuric acid plant built on site, which will release hydrogen sulfide, which is incredibly toxic and also stinky. And this is a very clean air shed, so we will definitely see a decrease in air quality. And the mine would also destroy upwards of 5,000 acres of habitat. I've added a picture here of another mine site in Nevada called Mount Denebo, which is a sacred landscape for the Western Shoshone tribes. And, you know, we hear time and time again from indigenous communities that there is no mitigation for sacred landscapes. And so just for a comparison here, you can see the arrow pointing to the white cliffs at the top. This has been designated as a sacred site. But however, mining at the flank of the mountain has been allowed, which is where the community used to hold gatherings, which they can no longer do, showing, you know, and as Mary has said here in a quote that I've added, you know, deep, deep impact to cultural practices. Next slide, please. This slide is just really briefly to touch on the wildlife aspects here. It's a very environmentally sensitive area with key species like sage grouse and endangered species like the Lahontan cutthroat trout that just show that, you know, due diligence needs to be paid here. Next slide, please. And then we have the community, the people who are, you know, who are facing this project on their lands close to their home and their livelihoods. There's a community group called People of Red Mountain that have formed to protect their cultural site from this project. And so a quote here is, you know, this mine will cause irreversible harm to the Fort McDermott Paiute and Shoshone tribe, ancestral massacre sites, water, air, medicines, and culturally important wildlife. The BLM did approve the mine without adequately consulting our tribal members. And also on to the right is local area rancher Edward Bartell, you know, who in his quote is deeply concerned about the long-term consequences of dumping basically acidic tailings onto public lands near his ranch, which you can see there, his rye fields are actually all groundwater fed. So we're really facing communities who are facing complete changes to their lifestyles from these projects. Next slide, please. And so the bigger picture here, you know, what's at stake? What are we missing as we're pushing forward to this EV-centric narrative, and what is being lost here? And the first one is that, you know, mining is incredibly destructive. It's destructive to environment, it's destructive to people. So we need to make sure that it's done judiciously, and we need to make sure that we hold the industry accountable. We cannot be looking the other way just because of the product's end use. And there's a danger to streamlining permitting, of which we think Thacker Pass could set a dangerous precedent. There's needless pollution and environmental damage. There's destruction of sacred sites, and also the ability to look at real and just solutions to address the climate crisis. Just solutions, we should be centering our directly affected communities who deserve free, prior, and informed consent. We should be looking at these different scenarios like what's put out in this report that can reduce the need for new mining and take pressure off of communities. We need to be thinking about more than carbon and protecting biodiversity and protecting our carbon sinks and our water resources. And we need to think about how mining in and of itself can be a major driver of climate change as well. All of this to show that we should be talking and thinking about different pathways moving forward. Thank you. Oh, and sorry, I will now pass it off to Ramón.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kassandra and everyone. So I'm not going to talk about all the issues, all the conflicts related to lithium mining in Chile, because I think it could be like really like too long, because there are many different cases. And then we also have like the cases, particular cases in Argentina and now also in Bolivia. But what I'd like to share here is that what Thea and Kassandra said before about the conflicts around indigenous rights, water, the right to consultation, for example, which is actually mentioned here in this slide. are common elements in all the cases that we know here in the Southern Cone, and also in other territories, also in the global north, in Nevada, right? So what we see here is actually the problem of extractivism, actually. So when we faced all these issues in Atacama Salt Flat, then we realized that the defense of the right to consultation and the defense of water and the environment was actually the kind of like the ignition. But then we realized that the problem was much larger, it's structural. And in countries like ours here in South America, actually, we are supposed actually to accept extractivism because it's the base of the economy, because people at some point actually are taught actually to live out of mining and actually accept that this is just like a natural condition for us. And what we see with the time is actually that sometimes the struggles were not necessarily against extractivism as a development model, but it is something that we from OPSAL, a network that actually was born as a response to this image, actually, to the conflict between the indigenous communities in San Pedro de Atacama and the state and SQM and Rockwood Lithium, which today is Albemarle. Actually was much more than this, just this. And that's how actually we realized that the problem was at some point being reproduced all over the region. And maybe next slide, we can see. So what we see today is that actually after learning of from these conflicts, and actually maybe most of you actually have already heard, we've also published some articles, a book, reports, and there is like much more actually literature today than 5 or 6 years ago. But the response actually has been also like a manifestation of the capacity of global capitalism to actually to adapt to the conditions and to respond actually to the demands of local communities, NGOs, and even the academia. So what we see today is the response from companies like SQM and Albemarle actually, and what some authors actually call social engineering, which is very much associated to greenwashing and ideas or concepts such as sustainable mining or green mining or even responsible mining, whereas the conditions of extraction actually don't change, and even like increase, for example, the extraction of water or brine. These very same companies actually are showing themselves as different companies, as responsible. And how they get this actually? They get this by investigating, researching the local culture, by creating NGOs or foundations, by actually financing research, their own research. And in these, the EV industry is actually directly associated. And for us, actually, this is making the problem of extractivism even more complex today. The next slide, please. So again, like we don't have enough time actually to talk about or explain or even try to explain what lithium mining means for Atacama salt flat or the other salt flats. I can actually suggest and share some material here in the chat for that actually to be done. But here I wanted to bring up this new aspect of the problem. And actually, I wanted to quote Rudecindo Espíndola. He's an indigenous comrade from the Toconao community and also a farmer in Atacama Salt Flats. And actually, he wrote an article in the book that we published. Actually, Thea also wrote a part of this book, a chapter. And in this chapter, Rudecindo tells how his experience in the territory, his foreparents, and how mining actually has been like expanding the territory and also making people like provoking divisions among peoples and communities, but also doing what he calls cultural extractivism, which is basically how especially lithium mines, but not only, but I'd say that especially lithium mines, because especially these companies, in response to all the criticism, is how actually they get now directly involved in the caring of local traditions, being actually the guardians of the carnival or the dances or the local food. So I think this is kind of one of the last manifestations of this form of extractivism, the green extractivism that we call. And I think that just to finish, that this dialogue between climate and community, OPSAL and other organizations actually is allowing us to better understand the strategies and what are the dominant narratives in the global north, which actually with all these scenarios, actually we know more about that, but we also see that there are other options, other alternatives, other horizons, but also for us to share this with the team, with the research team, with you, with the attendees right now, and to show you that actually the conflicts here at local scale are also much more complex than just extraction of water, brine. There is also this cultural, political dimension that we tend not to see. And sometimes even for local organizations, it's actually extremely hard actually to understand and to manage actually. Today, we also have like initiatives that promote so-called responsible mining, for example. So whereas the practices and the impacts of extractivism reproduce and actually make actually the territories even more vulnerable. Actually, the EV industry and countries in Europe, for example, actually are willing to certify or to accept mining just under labels that in practice don't mean much. So yeah, for now, I will pass it on to Thea, and also willing to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Alissa, Kassandra, and Ramón, and just especially just to some of those last points. I think that for those of you newer to thinking about extraction, Kassandra and Ramón kind of speaking to different phases of, let's say, a quote lithium boom, right? Ramón is located in a territory where lithium extraction has been going on for decades. And Kassandra is in a place in Nevada where there is one lithium mine, but she's talking about a future planned project, right? So this boom is ongoing, it's new, it's future, depending on where in the world you're situated. But the impacts are clearly can range from the devastating to the complicated. They have ecological and cultural ramifications and political ramifications as well. So hopefully that, broadened folks' horizons and understandings of what the extractive frontiers of the energy transition look like. And hopefully Alissa's presentation and some of my comments make it clear that how much extraction is required is, again, a social, a political, and economic choice. It is not a law of nature. It is not a given. And there are radically different ways to design our electrified, renewably powered future. And I think we should keep that in mind because more and more these questions of how these sectors are designed, of precisely how they are decarbonized, and of who bears the benefits and the costs will be the site of intense political debate. We hope that this report kind of gives folks evidence and data to make arguments for the maximally globally just transportation system possible. So with that in mind, I'd love to kind of pivot to our Q&A, which is already quite vibrant. We've answered some of the kind of technical questions already. So folks want to open the Q&A window. You can add questions. You can also look at the ones that we've answered. I want to raise up a few right now for discussion, but keep them coming. And we have almost 20 minutes left for Q&A. So first is a question for Raquel, which asks if we modeled the climate impacts of some of the biodiversity and water consequences of mining, right? Or if we, let me actually put it a little bit more broadly, if she doesn't mind, if we modeled the climate impacts of mining, right? And the mining sector does have multiple climate impacts. I'm going to give a little bit of an answer, and then I'm going to see if Kassandra or Ramón want to speak to this as well. So, the short answer is no, we didn't model those impacts. We assume a fully carbon-free transportation future, and we look at different ways that could be designed. So we're not kind of playing around with what could affect emissions, right? We're assuming zero emissions and looking at different ways to design that. But I think it is worth saying, and this is where I'll see if either Kassandra or Ramón want to say any more, that these landscapes are also carbon sinks, right? So when you dramatically alter landscapes, that has implications for the ability of the earth to absorb carbon. And that is no less true. We often think of carbon sinks in beautiful rainforests like the Amazon, which is, at the top and the most important one in the world. But deserts are also carbon sinks, right? And both Kassandra and Ramón are speaking from desert landscapes, but those do play a vital role in the carbon cycle. And there's more and more scientific research on that point. So when we think about mining for climate technologies, we should think obviously about the climate impacts, both of localized mining and the carbon capacity of the carbon absorption capacity of the landscape, but also, of course, the logistics and shipping and energy generation of mining and all of the ways that mining does itself also have a climate impact. Ramón or Kassandra, do you want to add anything about this point of the impacts of biodiversity or water loss and the connection to the climate crisis there?
Yeah, maybe I'd say something. Thank you for pointing that out, Thea. Actually, we focus always on Andean wetlands, something maybe I didn't mention. But from OPSAL, which is a collective actually composed by indigenous activists, non-indigenous activists and researchers, actually what we really focus on more than in actually getting involved in one particular conflict, which is already super complex, especially with all the greenwashing and the social engineering that I just mentioned, is we focus actually on the protection of Andean wetlands. Actually, we developed a whole initiative during more than a year, and we are now in the second stage of it. So we are pushing for higher standards and a different legal framework for biodiversity and wetlands in particular, and actually putting in the center the fact that Indian wetlands are carbon sinks and we need to protect them, because if we destroy these ecosystems actually through lithium or copper mining, or just by letting them abandoned, we will probably be contributing actually to the very problem that we're fighting. So yeah, thanks for saying that and for bringing that to this space.
And I just want to underscore something Ramón said and then pass it on to Kassandra, which is, I referred to these landscapes as deserts, but deserts also have wetlands, right? And the desert wetlands are uniquely vulnerable because they're naturally water negative systems, right? And so we have to think about ways to maintain that sort of natural equilibrium while mining is often a water intensive process. So Kassandra, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
I mean, I think that, both both of you guys touched on it pretty well. You know, the conversation around these things as exclusive from each other or only focusing on carbon is where we get quite dangerous, actually, because, you know, in my view in particular is just that the climate crisis is a lot more than just carbon emissions. It's a kind of about how we relate to the land, how we use the land, and how we're changing the land. And, you know, you're right, these big industrial projects, they destroy carbon sinks, and they're very water intensive, especially in desert landscapes where we are, you know, Nevada in particular, we are the most arid state in the United States. So we really need to be thinking about how we use our water resources, what happens when we pollute those water resources, as well as how we protect biodiversity and make sure that we keep the planet and Earth able to breathe and repair itself, which is something we're kind of taking out of the equation as we look towards rushing bigger mining projects.
Thank you so much, Ramón and Kassandra. I'm going to bring up a question at the other end of the supply chain, but also in a kind of rural landscape setting. So I really appreciate this question about what the implications are. So this is a question from Sam Lash, what the implications are of our modeling, but also of our broad approach to maximizing mobility and reducing mining, what the implications are for rural landscapes in the United States, which for reasons of built environment, the lack of other transportation options, and also this kind of sheer expansiveness of distances are places where car dependency really, I think, comes into relief, right? And it's you know, in certain ways easier to encourage more mass transit use and walking and cycling in suburban and even, in urban and even suburban contexts than it might seem in rural contexts. And that is something we did take into account in our modeling, but there's a broader question being asked about how to think about equitable, you know, electrified transportation in rural contexts. So I'll pass that on to our transpo expert, Alissa.
Thanks, Thea. Well, this is a hard question. In the mechanics of modeling, we did assume that rural populations would need vehicles, right? So they're the group of, they're the population that for whom we did not reduce or eliminate vehicle dependency. In terms of the total number of people, it's much smaller than people in the urban and suburban regions, but so we retain that vehicle demand in the model. But to get at the question about electrifying vehicles in rural areas, I'm in California, and we've had multiple, you know, people have been without power for weeks at a time, for example, due to wildfire every summer for the past few years. And those folks are very concerned about the push towards electrification of vehicles and everything else, because that's happening here as well. And it is true that we need, if we are going to become electricity dependent, we need to make the investments that are required in our electricity infrastructure as well. And that's particularly true in rural areas. And so we do need, if this is the solution that we are going to put all of our eggs into, as a basket goes, that was a bad metaphor, but if we're going to do that, we have to have these multiple investments happening. And I think that question is really, is a really important one. And what it's charging infrastructure, but also grid reliability, and also the other technologies. I think EVs are going to be the solution for most vehicles in the US, but not all. And we need to make sure that those other options are in there as well. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much, Alissa. I want to pivot to another question that really nicely links both ends of our report in terms of mining on the front lines and also the end use of transportation. And so this question asks, you know, how can organizers for transportation justice and transit equity, right? Folks that are organizing for better funding, for mass transit systems, for cities and suburbs to have more bike lanes and be more walkable and be safer for pedestrians, for reducing parking lots. You know, there are all sorts of groups around the country that are doing amazing work around a more equitable transportation system, right? And we hope this report is useful to you all. Several of you are on this call, right? But, you know, this question is an interesting question on the point from a perspective of kind of political strategy and organizing strategy, which is how can groups focused on the immediate local transportation needs of low and middle income Americans incorporate this understanding of a broader kind of lithium frontier, of the broader mining requirements of the energy transition in their local organizing work? Like, is there a way to bring in what Kassandra and Ramón are talking about in terms of local impacts when we are organizing for the most just mobility possible in the US, right? Like, how do we connect those dots, especially to folks that are maybe not used to thinking about global supply chains, or about the fact that batteries involve mining, or about the fact that, you know, we could kind of take this holistic global view. So I'm not sure if Kassandra or Ramón or Alissa or anyone I have maybe some thoughts there, but I'm curious about my panelists. You know, how can we kind of connect these dots when we're doing organizing for better transportation options in the US? And maybe Ramón could take this question in the other direction, the opposite way that it's asked, right? Like, how does it help organizing efforts across the Andean plateau in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, where lithium mining is taking place or being planned? How does it help to kind of know that the transportation system in the US could be organized radically differently? Does that help organizing efforts against rapacious extraction in Latin America? So you could sort of take the question from either angle, but I'll pass it on to Kassandra first if she has thoughts, or Ramón, either way.
Kassandra, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't think the question is how should we, but that we need to be. In my mind, we're talking, we're kind of fighting the same fight and we don't even really realize it in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that's really missing from the narrative and the conversation is the front end for these changes, right? What are we protecting? Who are the people we are protecting as we transition towards different forms of multi-mobility? And so I think, I mean, especially in the US context, it's really quite challenging to get people to think about really changing the way that they do things. That's kind of the barrier, the hurdle, especially when we have so many systems that make that so hard and such a challenge. And so I think that the way that we need to be looking at this is we need to be connecting those dots. We need to be connecting that organization work because, you know, we advocate for these solutions and changes in mobility and transportation because that reduces the pressure on frontline communities who are at this moment in time bearing the burden of increased extractivism. And so in my mind, the question is not how do we, but that we need to show what the front end is doing to our environment, to our peoples, to our communities, and how we can make multi-mobility and transportation options that reduce the demand, that reduce the impacts on our communities abroad, as well as getting into just transportation, not only in the urban centers, but also a just transition for the people who are bearing the burden of the front end of these issues.
Yeah, maybe I can also share some thoughts. For us, actually, it's not easy to fight extractivism, even in the territories. Actually, I know that like in every case or in every territory that I know, activists, whether indigenous or non-indigenous, doesn't really matter. There are internal conflicts when extractivism arrives or when extractivism is there and it's intending to expand. So I think that actually, yeah, like acknowledging that it's not always against extractivism or not everyone is against extractivism, but we still need to articulate and we need to articulate around common needs. And I think that the common struggle is for justice, mobility justice, social justice, environmental justice, climate justice. I think that when we talk about justice, instead of other terms that are a little bit like, you know, not very clear, you know, it's not the same to talk about climate action, actually. Climate action can be anything. Even the most polluting corporations actually use it as a term, but they don't speak about justice, you know. So when we actually in Upsal, what we do, we really believe, and we take it actually to the last actually you know, and to our very working context, let's say, is what we call the dialogue of knowledges. So we also don't feel that we are protecting anyone. I mean, we are all protecting everyone. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not as if I was called to protect, you know, communities or people who need me. Actually, we all need each other. If the local communities are able to protect these ecosystems, they're contributing actually to fight climate change. Climate change is affecting everyone, even in the big cities. In California, actually Chile is now actually on fire, unfortunately. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there are more than 20 wildfires in the center and center-south of Chile. We are all in danger today. So I think that we also need to not think about helping others or protecting others. We are all protecting everyone. This comes along, of course, with international solidarity. So what we actually put in practice within OPSAL, like ignoring the borders, national borders, like, you know, international conflicts, like historical conflicts between Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, that were also provoked by global extractivism and mine extractivism, actually, because of saltpeter, then because of copper, now because of lithium, whatever. You know, we ignore that. For us, it's more important, actually, what we have in common. And it's the same that we have in common with Thea and with all of you, actually. Actually, we know John Heather, for example, for a long time already. Also Thea, we are also part of Just to Life, Not to Mining network. I've been in Europe last summer, northern summer, and we met people in Serbia, we met people from Portugal, from Spain, and also urban, let's say, activists from Berlin, who are also fighting against the building of the Tesla Gigafactory in their territories. So it's not about people from Europe protecting people from South America. You know, I think this is much more about class, even, actually, because we are all working class people and we are depending on other people's decisions, you know. And also, I think that, just to finish, the urban and rural dialogue and articulation as well, because it's the rural territories are once again being sacrificed for the sake of unsustainable urban modes of living. But urban modes of living are not inherently unsustainable, I'd say. Actually, in the report, you're also mentioning how concentration can also be helpful, you know, to fight climate change, to build better transportation systems. It just depends on who's deciding for whom. And with that in purpose, with that in mind, let's say, urban and rural dialogue is also like fundamental.
Thank you so much, Ramón. And that last part about, you know, thinking across geographies, but also thinking in terms of broad coalitions that cross borders and that address the needs of poor working class and you know, economically precarious people, whether those needs, you know, immediately are for, you know, the clean water and how will mining impact water, or whether those needs are for mobility options beyond expensive individual EVs, right? And I see a question in the chat, and I know we're almost out of time, but I almost want to just, you know, raise it up briefly, because I think it's another direction to take this question of having a social justice lens on this whole issue. Someone asked about, you know, what are the options for unions to get involved in organizing for this more globally just transportation future, right? And they're asking in the US, though we could again make that a more global question if we wanted. And, you know, there have been, you know, I think first of all, like anytime that we're expanding the public sector and thinking about public transportation, we're empowering public sector unions who can be really powerful collective agents for fighting for broad social transformation. And that's been throughout throughout, sort of US history, right? So I think it's interesting to think about unions in that regard. And we can also think about this kind of divide and conquer strategy on the part of the auto sector, where they're trying to move into places without unions, in the United States, and trying to escape the power of the historically very militant auto workers unions, right? And thinking about how could those workers in this moment of electrification be brought into a broad coalition that focuses on access to mobility, not just individual vehicles, while of course defending their rights as workers. So there's a lot of questions there. I just wanted to kind of almost popcorn that a little bit and just say that, to Ramon's point, this is a really broad topic. It's a labor issue, it's an ecological issue, it's a transportation justice issue, and it's of course a climate justice issue. And I hope the kind of complexity, but also all the organizing and advocacy opportunities of this was clear in this presentation and in our report. And I just thank everyone, amazing attendance today and engagement in the chat. And I just thank everyone who presented and participated from around the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thanks, everyone. We'll send out this recording as well. I'm going to end the webinar now.